Oda just introduced the devil powers of the god knight Gunko, who much like the Gorosei has the powers of a demon from Japanese mythology, but one that you likely aren't familiar with if you're not deeply familiar with Japanese culture. But even beyond that, he's also introduced the historical record of the Harley that contains a massive yet so subtle reveal that you may have potentially missed entirely, as it single-handedly, and I'm not exaggerating, rewrites our very understanding of the entirety of One Piece history as we know it, showing that a world-changing cataclysm happened prior to even the Void Center itself, and even the fact that a third Nika existed. Join me in this mega analysis as we break down chapters 1135 and 1136 of One Piece. On the cover, the situation is quite cleverly resolved by having Tama be able to rescue herself. History doesn't repeat itself here, as she has grown strong enough as a kunoichi to be able to free herself from Hold'em. Not as strong as an impact as Luffy's Red Hawk, of course, but strong enough to free herself. The kick causes not just Hold'em to bleed, but also his lion Kamijiro, as after all they share the same body and cough blood from both mouths. Continuing with the next cover, Yamato takes the chance to apprehend Hold'em, who seemingly takes them to his boss, being who's who? The hideout definitely looks like his helmet, but it's interesting to think he may have been the only one of the Tobiroppo to escape and survive. Maybe this might be a good opportunity to see what lays beneath his helmet and to see his true face. Within the Owl Library, Chopper and Bonnie are perusing a large book. The script within it appears to be in Koyogo alphabet, though it seems to either use a very stylized font or a slightly different alphabet, as none of it is really readable. Saul introduces us to the Lord of the Owl Library, whose formal position is the Library Director. And this is the Owl Biblo, who oversees the library and causes all the books within it to grow giant. Just as we had guessed last week, this owl is in fact the fruit user that causes the books to grow so large. As Vegapunk Lilith explains, Biblo has eaten the Iku Ikonomi, making it an Ikse Fukuro, or a growing owl. As she clearly explains, the word Iku is derived from Ikse, or to grow, which is particularly attributed to someone who grows crops, or even grows animals or helps grow children. As such, the fruit would most naturally translate into the grow fruit, allowing this growing owl to grow any inorganic objects that come within its territory, a power befitting of the Island of Giants. As Lilith explains, this only applies to inorganic objects, so it can't grow people, animals, or plants, for example. It's also only able to grow objects in size when entering within its territory, which would shrink back to normal size when leaving. But conversely, books that were originally big cannot be made small, as Soul explains. The fruit only grows items, it cannot shrink them. Speaking of fruits, I do still wonder if Iskat from the Block Country was legitimately just a Neko Nekonomi or Cat fruit model lion, a Zoan user, or if there was anything more to it. Talking about Biblo's design though, it evidently looks like an actual owl, though a giant one of course, with glasses on it. And this might seem familiar to you, the idea of an owl being portrayed as a wise teacher wearing glasses is an image you've likely seen before, but why? Well, the reason traces all the way back to ancient Greece, where the goddess Athena, goddess of wisdom, was associated with the image of the owl. As such, the owl and its solemnity have served as a symbol of wisdom since times immemorial, which is why said myth is being referenced here with Biblo. After all, as Saul says, Biblo has seemingly been alive for centuries, though I wonder just how far back. In fact, it seems to have stood in this spot all that time, so if anything, the library may have been built around its roost. This goes double when it comes to Biblo's name, however. If you're strictly an English speaker, this might not sound so familiar to you, but if you speak a Latin language such as Italian, French, or Spanish among others, you'd have realized very quickly what the name means, and it's the fact that in those languages, library is always spelled the same way: biblioteca, bibliothek, or something similar. This all derives from once again ancient Greek, where biblion meant book, and as such, biblioteca means a library, a repository of books. From that word, we obviously get Biblo, the director of the Owl Library. If Biblo is the library director, then perhaps that chair we saw next to it is to convene with the owl, even if it doesn't seem to fully understand speech due to being a, well, owl, but it is still able to communicate to some extent, most likely, understanding the importance of the books. Chopper could probably speak with it, but it's not something we see happening here.
there. In the large panel, we also see Lily floating around with her dumb shoes, while Bunny is playing around on one of the railings. Even if the fall would be quite steep for a child, though she's definitely fallen from far worse, having fallen all the way down from the labo phase. Back at the school, Luffy and begrudgingly Usopp are playing on the giant swings we saw last chapter, though swinging them so far that even the giants below look tiny by comparison. Collon then attempts to get a hit on Luffy, but he easily counters with an elephant gun, showing that he was just testing him to witness his strength, being a kid who is still in love with the strength of the giants of Elbaf, hence why he asked Shanks to take him on his ship with him. We also find out that the delivery the bartender made for Collon, which she claimed was the favorite food for his father and Ripley, in Ripley's case being cowberries, showed that the two are in fact Collon's parents. By the way, we also get the name of the bartender being Mato. It turns out that Ripley is Collon's mom, but even further is the fact that she had a kid with a human, whom Collon describes as a former pirate who won't even lose to the likes of the giants of Elbaf. There is a good chance that this could be the silhouette we saw during the Louis Arnaud speech, as it was human-sized and feels narratively relevant to the story. After all, Mato seemed to indicate that Collon's father is still on the island, since she gave Collon food to give to his father. Once again though, we are still kept in the dark over the identity of this former pirate, as it's never named by name. Could it be Louis Arnaud himself? Is it actually Scopper Gaban? Or could the delusions of Shiki somehow come true? Though many jokes will no doubt arise about Collon's dad love for a tall woman, it is still a very heartwarming idea that even through such a big gap, love can still blossom no matter the race. It also shows that pretty much all hominid races in the One Piece world can reproduce with each other, much like our different races can, even in the cases of dwarves or giants. However, as Ripley explains, her husband feels self-conscious about the fact he grows older while she ages at a much slower rate, so he doesn't want to get formally married to make her suffer once he grows too old, instead remaining in a common law marriage with her. Robin's party, which includes Chopper, Vegapunk and Bunny, then decide to remain at the library with Saul, essentially splitting up the Straw Hats once again. While they believe this to be just momentary, with the upcoming chaos, this is likely to develop into something more serious. Frankie also mentions an interest in the treasure tree Adam, hoping to get a better look at it, potentially suggesting he might split off as well. Interestingly enough, Sal explains that there are a few other trees like the Adam out there, perhaps explaining how the Sunny's Wood was attained despite Elbaf's isolationism, but the Adam of Elbaf is in fact the oldest of them all. This makes sense, as it is the same as it was with the Sun Tree Eve. The Eve, encrusted within the red line going from the top sunlight all the way down to Fishman Island, is the original and likely most ancient of all of its type, what are scientifically called as the Yarukiman mangroves or hype mangroves. On the other hand, the trees of Shabondi or the Red Port were said to be all the same type as the Sun Tree Eve, but simply on a far smaller scale, showing a similar difference between the big original tree and its far smaller spawns, which is the case for both the Adam and the Eve. As Usopp once posed the question in chapter 612, I do also wonder if there is a connection between the two trees. Girth then provides clothes for the remaining Straw Hats, a hobby of hers she claims, just in a healthier way than Road. Frankie gets barrels for arms as well as a beard and a skull belt similar to Loki's, while Jimba's belt has the motif of a coiling snake, perhaps the Redline Jormungandr snake, and his hair is also tied in braids like many of the giants. As such, we see Girth going back to the village alongside Collon, Luffy, a usually fawning Sanji, Jinbei, Brook, Usopp, and what seem to be Nami and Zoro, leaving behind Team Robin, Chopper, and Frankie, with Lily, Sol, and Bunny as well. We can also appreciate in this panel how the Owl Library is directly built into the branch itself. Switching back to the castle, we actually get the name of the place being Aurusto in Japanese. This could potentially translate into several different ways, such as just Aurust, but it's more likely that it actually may be named after the English spelling of owl, thus being Owlst Castle. Regardless, it's hard to tell without a proper official romanization. Here we get a brief but much needed update on our intruders though. Our dear Shanks doesn't seem to do much this chapter, with the only thing we can really gaze from him being a sword that he appears to have at his hip. This sword is in the same shape as the Griffin, Shanks' sword, which is similar to Garling's blade, as well as the sword that was used by the silhouette appearing at the end of Vegapunk's speech, who we already had assumed was likely Shanks' evil doppelganger. finger, Shanks.
We also seem to notice a very sneaky detail in Shanks' silhouette that he does seem to have in fact what looks like a left elbow, which of course, if this actually were Shanks, would be simply impossible.
As for the girl, we don't really get her name, but we do instead get a valuable clue, being her speech pattern in Japanese. As one might assume, her speech pattern is incredibly high and mighty, thinking very highly of herself. She speaks proudly and arrogantly, just like a celestial dragon would speak, but the clear difference is that she sounds at least more cultured and sophisticated than ignorant buffoons like Charlos. We are still assuming that these are god knights, but it makes sense that they have more honor and decor than those who only care about their material desires. As she speaks, the girl does make quite a clever play in words, as she states, "Zuga takai hiremono," which literally means, "your head is too high, insolent." The expression, "your head is too high," refers to someone who thinks too highly of themselves, what we'd perhaps call being on a high horse, and so the girl demands that this giant not think so arrogantly of himself. However, at the same time, this is meant quite literally, as she forces his head from being too high into falling to the ground beneath her. She's basically saying both that he shouldn't be too arrogant and also that he should show proper respect by groveling his head beneath her feet like the inferior being that he is. She even clarifies, "Did you assume I was posing a question? It was an order. What do you not understand about the word answer?" This order in particular, as she stated earlier, was, "We are in search of the being called Loki." The fact she calls him a being, or jinbutsu in Japanese, also shows how they perceive creatures beneath them as inferior. It's interesting, however, as it shows that they don't seem to be so interested in the Straw Hats right away, but rather wish to locate Loki. What is the reason for doing so? Do they wish to eliminate him, or maybe even want to free him to bring destruction to Elbaf? Would Loki actually corroborate with them, or will Loki turn out as a good guy as Mosa indicated? As the giants tell her that they can't just divulge Loki's location, the girl suddenly fires something really quickly, as indicated by the sound effects do 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 do. It's hard to notice, but if you look closely, there are several bandages that are wrapping up the giant's body, squeezing his muscles until he's in so much pain that he collapses, as the sounds boki and baki are heard, which represent bones being crushed. This suggests some type of bandage-based devil power, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Regardless, for her to bring a giant of Elbaf to his knees, a guard of the castle no less, shows how powerful she truly is. Back at the West Village, we get a summary of all the giants the Straw Hats have helped, including Dory and Broggy, Oimon Kashi, Hyrudin and Stanson. The giants praise Luffy as not just an emperor, but also as a Dai Kaizoku, or Great Pirate, a title that has been exclusively been used for people as powerful as Roger, Shanks, or Whitebeard previously in the series. We can also see Zoro drinking in the corner, while Nami's ears are about to burst from the loud cheers, as all the giants share a toast. However, intruding upon the party is Mountain Beard Yarul, who you were already told a few chapters ago was still alive. He was one of the two captains of the giant warrior pirates before Dory and Broggy, who we also saw in Big Mom's flashback, where Lin killed his co-captain Yorul. He doesn't look that much different, aside from the sword going through his head, which he claims the helmet blocked most of it, though I wonder in what battle he got this attack, perhaps being against Loki. He's also so tall that he even dwarfs the likes of Broggy, who is already a stunning 21.3 meters tall. As his description explains, he holds the title of the oldest person in the world, a fact we were already aware of given how he was 345 in Big Mom's flashback 63 years ago, which now makes him 408 years old. To be clear, he isn't the oldest creature in the world. The oldest creature that we know of at least is Zunisha, whose age was stated to be over 1,000 years old in the Weaver cards, over twice Jarl's age. But if we're technical, Jarl isn't even the oldest person, as of course we have the figure of King Imu, who we've been told has likely been alive ever since the Void Century. Of course, we don't know how human Imu really is, but even the Gorosei, as far as we know, are humans who have been conferred devil powers by Imu, and Saturn alone was at least over 200 years old, so it makes you wonder just how old some of the rest are, as I feel at least one of them must have been over 400 years old. Regardless, it has been implied that it is through the powers of the Perennial Youth Operation, or at least some power Imu is able to share with them, them, so Yarl would be the oldest naturally aging person in the world, as well as the publicly known oldest person in the world. This is due to the fact that giants live longer than humans do, though in Yarl's case he appears to be extraordinarily old, similar in age to what we would consider a centenary for us humans. To put it into perspective, when Yarl was born 4 centuries ago, Mont Blanc Noland hadn't even set foot on Jaya yet. And when he was 200 years old, Emmet ended up raiding Marijois during that time. That's just how old he is. The other oldest characters we know of who aren't giants through normal means would be the Burkan Haredas at 97 years old, being followed by the only other 2 nonagerians in One Piece, Stroisen and Brook. There is a special case in the case of Dr. Kureha, who is currently 141 years old, but as she has claimed, there is a secret behind her perennial youth. A secret no one is ever willing to listen to, despite us readers being very curious personally. Maybe it has to do with the previous user of the Ope Ope no Mi being a certain incredibly famous doctor. Resting on Yarl's hand, Luffy enjoys the Etosaurus meat, claiming that it tastes like dinosaur meat, referring to the time that he ate dinosaur on Little Garden with Dory. This of course makes sense because despite the giants of Elbaf calling it a moose, the Etosaurus is in fact a dinosaur. In the foreground we see Collon dancing around, particularly doing what is likely to be the Nika pose, particularly accentuated by his smile. Yarl also mentions that it's rare for humans to make it past the underworld, but not unprecedented as obviously Ripley's husband is currently hanging around. The other Straw Hats interact with the giants different ways, such as Usopp telling the tale of how they fought oars, some giants marveling at Jinbe for his blue skin, and Sanji telling them of a place that he considers like paradise, being Mermaid Cove, referring to the port town of Fishman Island where Sanji had his greatest nosebleed. Road apologizes to the Straw Hats for his actions, even though he admits to enjoy being dominated by girth, literally calling her an S in Japanese, or a sadist, but explains the reason he was role-playing was to fulfill the inner dream of the people of Elbaf to become the Sun God, which is why he was calling himself the Lord Sun God. Road, however, believes that the Sun God embodies the idea of ruling over the entire world, whereas other giants argue that the Sun God is the god of liberation, Kaiho no Kami, others a god of destruction, Hakai no Kami, or even a god of laughter, Warai no Kami. This is a practice that we've actually seen before in other cultures as well, particularly that of the people of the sky. The people of Skypiea refer to the ruler as god, as did the people of Burka, the other major sky island, and given how they might potentially share some connection with the Void Century, they also may have taken this tradition of wanting to become like the Sun God as a form of control, with that ultimately seeping into their culture. Yarl then introduces us to something that in Japanese is known as the Hare, which would translate as something like Harley, what he describes being a Shinten, or in other words, a holy script. In fact, in the next panel, Yarl even overlays the phonetic word Harley over the kanji Shinten, making it one single word. The kanji for this word literally use the kanji for God Scripture, meaning it's a compilation of mythical accounts regarding their religion. You could compare it to holy scriptures such as the Bible or the Quran, but in this case, this could be more comparable to the Edda, being the Icelandic compilation of Norse culture and mythology that has served as one of the most important Bibles for preserving Viking mythology. So in this case, the Harley is likely Oda's version of the Edda, a book that describes ancient Elbaf history but told through a slightly more mythological lens. Yarl himself even explains that the word Harley is so old that there is no real meaning, so there's pretty much nothing that we can do to try and guess what it actually means here. But the fascinating thing here, however, is that Yarl reveals that according to the Harley, the world has already been destroyed twice. Not once, but twice. And this single comment potentially revolutionizes our very understanding of One Piece history as we know it. This, trust me, is a massive deal because our historical understanding so far is, of course, the story of the Void Century. 900 to 800 years ago, an ancient kingdom rose to prominence, leader by the first pirate, a man they called Joy Boy, who became the user of the Hito Itonomi model Nika, transforming him into the mythical figure of the sun god Nika. However, losing against
against the allied powers of Nerona, Imo, and 19 other rulers, Joy Boy and his forces were eradicated, and a great calamity was unleashed upon the world, drowning it in 200 meters of sea level, submerging most of the continents. And yet, the Harley would suggest that this wasn't the first calamity to unleash upon the world, but rather the second. Unless it's somehow telling of two calamities happening right after another, which doesn't seem to quite be the case given how it's worded. If there really was another calamity, it would have had to have been before the Void Century. After all, there is just simply no record or hint of any major calamity in the past 800 years, and without wiping an entire century like the government did, it's not something that could have happened in this period recently, meaning it had to have happened sometime prior to 800 or 900 years ago in the far distant past, even beyond the Void Century. Specifically in Japanese, Jarl says, Hare ni yoreba sekai wa sudeni nido kowareteiru, which literally translates into, according to the Harley, the world has already been broken 2 times. And he further adds, and in both of those occasions, the existence of the sun god Nika was recorded. This indicates that at both of these calamities, Nika was present. In the case of the Void Century, we know quite well who this was, being the individual called Joy Boy who ate the Hitoitonomi model Nika and thus transformed into the Warrior of Liberation, the mythical figure. But we had always assumed that Joy Boy was the first Nika, but what if he wasn't? To our understanding, Nika is not a real person. That has been stated several times by many different people, that Nika isn't real, just a fictional being that people venerated that became reality through a mythical devil fruit. So how do we explain this Nika existing before even Joy Boy? Well, let's explore the 3 different scenarios that could explain this conundrum. The first possibility is that, quite simply, Joy Boy was not the first user of the Hitoitonomi model Nika. Sometime prior to the Void Century, during time of a great calamity, a user appeared, awakening the Hitoitonomi model Nika. After this user's death, the fruit would continuously evade others until it would fall into the hands of Joy Boy, becoming the second Nika. This is the safest and most logical theory, but it does bring out an oddity, being that this would mean that devil fruits have existed since long in the past, even before the Void Century itself. Our prevailing theory at the moment is that the Sea Devil, the creator of all devil fruits, is most likely Nerona Imo. There's a massive avalanche of evidence to suggest that's the case that I've already extensively talked about, but if this is indeed the case, it would mean that devil fruits have existed since long before the Void Century, but there's nothing saying that Imo wasn't already immortal prior to the Void Century, as maybe they bided their time for centuries until they were finally able to execute their master plan. Or alternatively, Nerona Imo was born in the Void Century, but the Sea Devil is an entity that has existed since even before the Void Century, and so Nerona Imo only became that entity later on, perhaps through also eating a mythical fruit in a concept similar to Nika, or in some other unknown way. So it's all certainly possible and likely the most logical explanation. There existed a Nika in the past, and already existed a Sea Devil, but then we got the figures of Joy Boy and Imo. The second possibility is that Joy Boy was the first user of the Hitoitonomi model Nika, but the Nika present during the previous calamity wasn't a fruit user, but rather an actual person. Maybe a Nika did indeed exist in even more ancient times who saved the world, but his exploits became myth and legend, which eventually gave birth to the existence of a devil fruit. While this would check out at first, I don't think it's quite the case, as Jarl seems to describe both accounts of Nika being one and the same, even describing Nika as having pure white hair and a scarf of white clouds, which are characteristics of Zoan awakenings, suggesting the first Nika also awakened through a devil fruit, and thus both of these Nika supposedly being devil fruit users. But it's also possible that it's just a conflated myth of this original Nika, and thus the original Nika and the original Sea Devil may have been separate entities to those incarnated by their fruits. This duality could even help make a lot of sense in explaining the great duality we've seen across the series. Originally, during the first calamity, we may have gotten the duality of Nika and the Sea Devil. Then, during the Void Century, we got the duality of Joy Boy, the second Nika, and Nerona Imo, the Sea Devil. And then in the present, we have a new Nika in the form of Luffy, and perhaps a new devil in the form of Blackbeard. Speaking of these, we actually get the Harley's mythical depiction of Nika, showing as a warrior in a loincloth with, just as Yarl said, pure white hair and white clouds, as well as a cartoony aesthetic with its rubber hose limbs. At the same time, Nika is also here seen with a sword and shield, unlike the sword and spear he was previously depicted with, which makes one thing very noticeable: the fact that he's another Mihawk victim. I mean, the fact that the shield he carries bears the symbol of the ancient kingdom, being a sun with 8 circles around it. The symbol has been used for the flag of Alabasta, the symbol of the Shandians, the symbol in Kuma's church, the crest of the Kosuke clan and the Minks, or even the flags in Rhodes Block Country, among many others. The symbol is known to be associated with the ancient kingdom and the D clan, but they perhaps in turn may have taken it from a potentially even older myth of Nika. However, there's a third possibility that is far more creative, yet simple in the end: the fact that maybe this original Nika and even this whole original Calamity were all fictitious, or at least in part. What if the first Nika really was just a mythical creature that never existed? Maybe the Calamity was indeed real, or maybe only to some extent, but people's desires to be saved created the mythical figure of Nika that eventually got conflated with the myth of the Void Sentry. After all, the Harley is this old text that likely played through a long game of telephone, so it isn't really impossible. Maybe this original depiction was described as having white hair and white clouds, and that's why it looks that way in Zoan Awakening. However, again, given Yarl's words, this seems less unlikely, but again, not impossible. It's hard to say for sure. However, this brings yet another potential game changer. We're getting into theory territory here, but in my mega theory, I propose the idea that the One Piece treasure is actually the original Laugh Tale, starring the fictional character of Nika as its main character, which could be true or not, but I assume that this was a tale that was developed during the Void Sentry and that Nika came to form as a fictional figure during that period. But if I were true in this case, if Nika existed prior to the Void Sentry, then how old is the One Piece? Was Joy Boy like Roger a pirate king who found and cherished the One Piece but ultimately didn't create it, only left it behind? Or, alternatively, what if Nika existed prior to the Void Sentry, but it was only during the Void Sentry where the myth was properly recreated within the story that is the One Piece, created and left behind by Joy Boy? Just how far does the origin of Nika and the One Piece go? Well, in the end, we can't say for sure. The truth is simply still too muddled, but we can pivot to another big mystery we need to answer, which is, what was the Great Calamity, the first Great Calamity? What could be the great disaster that happened prior to the Void Sentry? Well, despite what some think, we actually know a decent bit about the Void Sentry and even the period before it. What's most well documented is the period that precedes it, spanning from some period in the past all the way to the year 600, the start of the Void Sentry. This was the period known as the Era of Slaves. Discrimination, persecution, and slavery were rampant during this period of time, where tyrannical human kings were in control of power and abused those under them, particularly those of other races. The fishmen were said to have been driven from the surface to the ocean floor, forcing them to found Fishman Island there as they could not live on their surface, whereas the Tontata were entirely enslaved by the Don Quixote family. It was a period of great suffering, one that likely was what led to the events of the Void Sentry, with people being fed up by the oppression, wishing to become pirates and to be free. It was all an escalation of the suffering that came beforehand. But what if this first calamity was the one that perpetrated the world into such a state of suffering? And what could it be to have broken the world in the same way that the Great Flood did? Well, one thing that comes to mind, perhaps one of the oldest unexplained mysteries in this star's story, is the Red Line and the Grand Line. Both of these formations seem to have existed since prior to the Void Sentry, such as the Lunaria having a godland settlement atop the Red Line prior to Marie-Joie, and it doesn't seem like the Great Flood had much to do with them. So what if these formations, which just like the flooding don't seem very natural at all, and literally broke the world apart, weren't created during the second cataclysm, but during the first one? The abnormality of such a linear and vertical continent and the unusual magnetisms of such a straight ocean could perhaps finally be explained. As for when the first cataclysm took place, we mentioned it being before the Void Sentry, but what if it also also had something to do with the ancient weapons. Could that help us not just understand how it happened, but also give us a time frame? After all, it is said the ancient weapons like Poseidon are reborn every several hundred years, a stretch of time that seems to be around 700 to 800 years, explaining the distance between the Void Century and the present, having been born basically towards the end of the Void Century and now again in the present. So what if we go backwards from the end of the Void Century on the year 700 to around 700 years prior? We get year 0. The current One Piece story uses the Kai and Reiki calendar, or the Sea Circle calendar, which places the story at the year 1524. The Void Century ended on the year 700, and so year 0 would be 700 years prior to that. I've always wondered what happened during year 0 to mark it as the start, but what if it really was this, the first Calamity? What if an event of historical proportions took place, marking that as the original starting year of the current calendar? Or even more logical, what if Nika was even a figure revered like Jesus, that his first appearance, birth, or awakening came to be known as the year 0? Is this perhaps also the reason why more commonly it's more favored to say X years ago than using the Kai and Reiki calendar by people of the government? Okay, moving on from this mind-bending reveal though, Yarl adds a very interesting comment about Nika. Is he a hero who appears to protect the world from being broken apart further, or is he a destroyer seeking to break it all? At the very least, when the world's very shape is changed, those are the times when he appears. Therefore, those in power at the time fear the possible appearance of Nika. Once again, he presents the concept of duality, where Nika is perceived by some as a liberator and bringer of hope, while others see him as a bringer of destruction. To be fair, this makes perfect sense. Nika has always appeared during times where the world's very shape has been changed, as he says, but we also know for a fact that Jobe was heavily involved with the ancient weapons during the Void Century. From what we currently historically understand, Jobe seemingly had good intentions and meant to use the ancient weapons for a change for good, as Otohime said, but perhaps the very fact that he was in possession of them at some point may have confused the records that would remain of him, with some conflating him for a destroyer rather than a savior. After all, even Vegapunk said the same thing, that he couldn't judge if Jobe was meant to be an agent for good or evil, and even then, it's one of the most fundamental themes of One Piece that morality is always ambiguous. But what is interesting is that Loki definitely took the interpretation of Nika from this side of the myth, believing that Nika is someone who laughs at others, and instead of being silly for the sake of making others laugh, that he is a mischievous god who plays pranks and brings destruction. This is why, since youth, Loki has wanted to be like Nika, bringing destruction in his wake with his pranks, which fits a lot the depiction of the god Loki in Norse mythology, a trickster. Though interestingly, Jarl claims that so did Harald, strengthening the idea that the fruit they pass down may have something to do with that whole idea of becoming the sun god. Loki's birth was already cursed, having been prophesied to kill his father. He was born right before Linlin's raid on the West Village, a fact we can actually verify as it was literally mentioned all the way back in chapter 866, and a year after his birth, his mother died, with other disasters following soon after. At age 10, having befriended the beasts of the underworld as mentioned before, he unleashed them upon the villages, and later on would pay pranks in the form of bringing destruction and arson. Yet, he viewed it all as just a prank, laughing at his enemies just like Nika would, in his own twisted way of viewing it. The giants even mentioned that during Harald's absence this all became worse, but it is odd that Harald would be absent. Was he out of the country, and for what reasons? Could this even be during the period of the rocks 40 years ago, given the long age of giants? Following this, however, Loki murdered his father and ate the fruit in his possession, leading to the conflict we were told about. Jarl tried to stop him but was stabbed in the head, leading to the sword we see on him now. We also get a quick glimpse at a shadowed Harald, perhaps being saved for an eventual flashback, being shown in what looks like a painting in the castle, sitting upon the throne. We can't quite see his face, but he does appear to have some sort of mustache, a beard or protrusion coming out of his face. But then, 6 years ago, Loki set out to sea to cause even more rampage, but was ultimately stopped by Shanks after he got his bounty, who brought him back at Elbaf just as we had assumed. This also likely confirms what he had assumed, that Shanks' rise to power and becoming a Yonko 6 years ago may have been due to him defeating the feared Loki, who even the government was growing concerned about, giving him such a high bounty as the times coincide perfectly. Just like how he defeated the Music Devil King Tot Music Musica and the destruction of Elygia gained him his first bounty of rebellion, his defeat of Loki likely brought him even more recognition, a higher bounty, and a position as a Gunko. This also explains why Shanks is so buddy-buddy with the people of Elbaf. But it all adds more mystery to Loki's claim that Shanks was a coward, the same words that we've heard ever since chapter 1 with Iguma. Was it for sparing his life and giving him back, or is there more to it? This, however, all puts into question Loki's character, as Luffy questions if he's really a bad guy, getting the impression that maybe he really isn't that bad. On one hand, this is how Luffy feels about him, and we've also seen how he seems to care a lot for the mysterious Mosako. Yet at the same time, he said he was going to kill Luffy and is even willing to let his pet wolf die later in the chapter because he accepts that is his fate. It certainly makes him an interesting, complex and layered character whose true morality still isn't fully clear. So perhaps this creates a possibility that might even explain the truth behind Loki's fruit. Yarul told us about the ambiguity of Nika's true morality. Some believe him to be a god of salvation, while others view him as a god of destruction, likely especially conflated during the Void Century with the ambiguity of Joy Boy's actions with the ancient weapons. Even now at present, Luffy was foreseen to destroy Fishman Island, but is this a destruction for evil, or is it one for good? As such, both of these interpretations may have taken shape as different myths, and form two different mythologies. I'm not necessarily saying there was a good Nika and an evil Nika in reality, those seem to have historically existed at different times, as Jarl explains, and I think that those actually may both have been good, but rather I'm saying that there may have been two different interpretations of the same Nika. I propose this since his introduction, that Loki's claim about being the sun god may not just be wanting to be like the people of Elbaf do, but him actually having some power to become the sun god through his fruit, perhaps there being some other interpretation of Nika. And now it sounds like it could really be the case. So what if Loki actually did eat the Nika fruit, but a version of Nika that was based on the myth that he's a destroyer rather than a savior, thus embodying the warrior of destruction, what would be Hakai no Senshi, compared to Luffy being the warrior of liberation, Kaiho no Senshi. This might even explain how Loki literally set ablaze the villages of Elbaf with sun like fire, all while laughing to himself, just like Nika did. In spite of all this though, Loki offered Luffy to tell him where Shanks is in exchange for the key to free him. This of course is almost certainly a lie, as Loki wouldn't really know where Shanks is, and even Loki literally thought that he'd kill Luffy right after being freed. However, Zoro and then joined by Nami, our original beloved trio, decide to accompany Luffy and at least gauge the situation with the assistance of Road. Road particularly claims to be Nami's servant, but Zeus establishes the hierarchy that he is Nami's first servant and Sanji's the second servant, making reference to their little debate from chapter 903. As they approach the castle, we can see that the gates have been smashed, but last time we saw them, they didn't seem smashed, so this was likely done by the two celestial dragon intruders. Speaking of them, we see that they've swiftly reached Loki, who, by the way, we get his laugh being Doga ha ha. Shanks and the girl elaborate that they haven't heard from the Cypherpole agents they sent to the island in 20 days, only claiming to have been abducted by a large crow. It is now evident that these were the previous people found in Rhodes Block Country, having been abducted by his crow Mugen and forced to play in his RPG. And so the government has instead decided to send two of their god knights, who even Loki calls them as such, though the reason why they are here isn't fully clear yet. Loki seems to imply that the government desires his power, given his enormous strength, but I guess it speaks to the government's arrogance that they think that they can control someone like Loki. We get even more of the girl's speech pattern, sounding even more sophisticated and classy than she did before. Shanks, on the other hand, however, speaks too little to really get much of a feel of his speech pattern, likely an intentional choice to keep mystery. Oda even keeps being sneaky and covering the left side of his face, all but confirming that there really is no scar there. We get a side profile later on that covers his eye with his hair, but even then it really doesn't look like there's a scar there. More importantly though, we get the girl's name and appearance being called Gunko. Her name is written in kanji but has a phonetic katakana reading. The kanji are those of Gun and Ko, the first meaning military and the second meaning girl. Thus her name literally just translates as military girl or army girl, and her text box also confirms beyond any doubt that she is one of the god knights. Sadly, however, we don't get the name of her celestial dragon family, yet more oddly enough,
enough, she doesn't carry the title of Saintess that female celestial dragons like Charleria bear, or even that of Saint for that matter. As we had noticed before, she wears a sort of military-style hat, but her outfit in general is more similar to that of a gakuran, which is a type of traditional school uniform in Japan. Gakuran, or Western-style school uniform, is a type of old-style school uniform that looked a bit militaristic due to its older influence when it became used. In anime, it is often generally associated with delinquent characters, which makes Gunko's appearance quite interesting. The militaristic theme is even visible in her name, as mentioned. Gakuran female outfits were, in some cases, especially in anime, known for having quite short skirt length, which might be the reason for her skirt being so short that, well, she basically has no pants, though obviously that's just Ode exaggerating things. But she also has heterochromia, being the condition of having both eyes being different colors. In this case, one light and the other dark. We don't know if this is just natural heterochromia or if there is some deeper reason, such as a power or past incident. She also seems to have a, well, let's call it hatred for pants and long sleeves, as well as weird boots. These long sleeves in particular tie with her power, which we see here better as she's able to turn her clothes into a flying sash, one she can command as it strangles the poor great wolf to death. That is why she wears long sleeves, so that she has enough fabric to transform, as we see her transforming the sleeve into sashes and then back into a sleeve. This lines up with her using the sashes to strangle the muscles of the giant earlier, but I wonder what kind of power this is. A boring answer would be that this is some sort of sash-creating paramecia fruit like an obi-obi-no-mi that creates sashes and bandages, but honestly that would both be very lame and kind of not fully add up as well. After all, keep in mind that this is one of the god knights who got teleported to the castle via summoning circle, so much like the Gorosei, she too likely is some form of demon. But then, what demon would allow her to just create sashes like that? Well, the answer is pretty obvious if you're familiar with Japanese culture, but may not be that obvious if you're not familiar with it. We know the Gorosei are mostly inspired by demonic creatures from different mythologies, such as the sandworm, the feng-shi, or the pale horse, though in this case it's also called the bakotsu, a yokai, but we also get Japanese demonic creatures such as the yuki or the itsumade. So in this case it would make a lot of sense if this was the itamomen. The itamomen is described as a series of sashes that come to life, moving around the air and strangling others, just like we see Gunko doing here, often killing others by asphyxiation or by crushing them with her sashes. In some modern depictions, the itamomen is also depicted as a female who generates those sashes. One of the more modern depictions that you might actually be familiar with being Daki from Kimetsu no Yaiba, who similarly uses sashes to kill others. And as such, this would be a perfect fit for Gunko, making her a demonic creature from mythology, much like the others who have attained Imu's favors. And yet, it doesn't stop here, because there is one characteristic of Gunko's powers that just simply makes no sense, and it's the fact her sashes seem to end in the shape of a devil's tail. But why? Because we had seen Imu using this very same devil tail to kill Cobra and attack Sabo, so how could Imu have what seems to be Gunko's powers? Well, the boring answer could be that they just look alike, and the reason why is because she's also some kind of devilish creature like Imu, or simply doing something in Imu's image out of respect. But on the other hand, what if these two really are one and the same? What if Gunko is actually King Imu? Okay, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not saying it's impossible, but obviously that's still not quite likely what's happening here. But what if Gunko's power is indeed Imu's power? Specifically, what if this opens the door for the possibility that Imu isn't restricted to one single power, but may actually possess all the powers that they confer to others? What if Imu gave Gunko the ability to become an itamomen because Imu also has that ability, which he used against Cobra and Sabo? Does that mean that Imu could also transform into a Yuki or Itsumade, for example? After all, when Sabo attacked Imu, they transformed into this big creature with large fangs, and yet right after, Imu transformed as well into this weird hominid creature with large arms and some sort of beak, and later became just a large pair of eyes. What if Imu's powers as the devil are so
so flexible that the powers they can confer are also the powers that they possess, making Emo a being of strength beyond our imagining and a agglomeration of different devils. What if it's the truth that holds the history of the Nikas of the past, as well as the Sea Devil who most likely became the king of the world? What other secrets do the folds of history hold?